The confession came out of her like something she had been holding underwater for years, finally breaking the surface with a gasp she could not control. "I was not expecting anyone kind," Theresa Townsend confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes cast down at the rough-hewn wooden table in front of her as if she were ashamed of the admission itself, as if kindness were a trap she had learned not to walk into. And Sheriff Wallace Winslow, without a single word, without a flicker of performance or false grace, pulled out the chair beside him and set it facing her, an invitation so simple and so quiet that it nearly broke her in half. The saloon around them hummed with the low sounds of Redemption Creek going about its evening, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of boots on sawdust floors, the distant pluck of a fiddle string being tuned in the back corner. But in the small orbit of space that existed between those two chairs, the world had gone absolutely still. Theresa did not sit immediately. She stood with her carpetbag clutched against her chest like armor, her jaw set in the rigid way of a woman who has been forced to learn self-protection before she ever learned to rest, and she looked at the chair as though it might be pulled away the moment she reached for it. Wallace did not rush her. He simply rested his forearm on the table, his tin star catching the amber light of the oil lamp overhead, and he waited with the patience of a man who understood that trust was a thing you could not demand. That moment, that simple, devastating moment of the pulled chair, was the end of a journey that had begun 6 weeks earlier in a city Theresa Townsend had been desperate to escape. St. Louis, Missouri, in the autumn of 1882, was not a kind city to a woman alone. Theresa had been 26 years old, working as a seamstress in a garment house on Market Street, living in a single rented room above a bakery when the letter had arrived. It was not addressed to her, not originally. It had been addressed to her older sister, Clara, who had died of typhoid fever in August, leaving behind nothing but a small wooden box of letters, a worn Bible, and one unanswered correspondence from a cattle rancher in the New Mexico Territory named Gerald Holt, who had placed an advertisement for a wife in the St. Louis Dispatch. Theresa had read the letter twice. Then she had read it a third time. Gerald Holt described himself as a man of industry, 42 years old, with 300 head of cattle and a homestead outside a town called Redemption Creek. He described himself as steady, God-fearing, and in need of a woman of good character to manage his household. The word steady had done something particular to Theresa. She had not had steady in her life since her parents had died of cholera when she was 14, since she and Clara had been shuffled through a series of distant relatives who regarded them as burdens, since Theresa had worked herself to bone exhaustion in a series of garment houses and laundries to keep herself fed and housed. Steady sounded like the most beautiful word in the English language. She had written back to Gerald Holt. She had presented herself honestly, or almost honestly. She told him she was 26, that she was hardworking and capable, that she was her sister's closest kin, and had received his correspondence through a circumstance of grief. She had not mentioned the dark past that followed her like a shadow, the name of the man in St. Louis who had made her most recent years a particular kind of horror. That man was Edward Crane. And it was because of Edward Crane that Theresa Townsend had packed everything she owned into a single carpetbag and boarded a train heading southwest without waiting for Gerald Holt's reply, trusting that the distance would be enough, that the New Mexico Territory was far enough from Edward Crane's reach that she could finally breathe. She had been wrong about Gerald Holt. She discovered this within 40 minutes of arriving at the Redemption Creek Stage Depot on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1882. Gerald Holt was not 42. He was closer to 55, with deep-set eyes that moved over her in a way that made her skin crawl, a habit of speaking about women in general as though they were livestock, and a breath that smelled permanently of rye whiskey. He had taken her carpetbag from her hand without asking, loaded it into the back of his wagon without speaking to her directly, and had driven her out toward his property in near total silence, broken only by occasional observations about her figure. By the time they reached his homestead, a cramped, unwashed collection of buildings that bore no resemblance to the respectable household his letter had described, Theresa had already catalogued every possible exit. The trouble was, there were no exits. She was in the middle of the New Mexico territory. She had spent almost everything she had on the train ticket and the stage fare. She had nowhere to go and no one to go to, and the man she had agreed, however informally, to consider as a potential husband was already making it clear that he considered the arrangement already settled, regardless of her feelings on the matter. She lasted 4 days at Gerald Holt's homestead. On the 4th night, when she heard him come in after dark, heavy-footed and slurring, she had taken her carpetbag from under the narrow cot in the room he had assigned her, and she had slipped out the back door and walked the 7 miles into Redemption Creek in the dark, guided by the stars and by the absolute certainty that whatever awaited her in that town would be better than what was behind her. She arrived in Redemption Creek just as the sun was painting the horizon orange and gold, footsore and hollow with hunger, and she sat down on the wooden boardwalk outside the general store and tried to think. She had enough money for 1 meal, perhaps 2 if she was careful. She had no job and no connections in this town. She had skills: she could sew, she could keep books, she could cook, she could manage a household, but skills without an introduction and without references were difficult to sell. She could not go back to St. Louis because of Edward Crane. She could not go back to Gerald Holt's homestead. And so she was, in the most precise sense of the word, trapped. The general store opened at 7 in the morning. The woman who unlocked the door and nearly stepped on Theresa was small and sharp-faced, in her mid-40s, with quick, clever eyes, and a name that Theresa would learn was Mabel Higgins. Mabel Higgins looked at Theresa on her boardwalk with the bag clutched in her lap and said, with zero ceremony, "You are Gerald Holt's mail-order woman, aren't you?" It was not a question. Theresa straightened her spine and said, "I am no one's anything." Something shifted in Mabel Higgins's expression. She opened the door wider and said, "Come inside then, I just put coffee on." That was how Theresa learned that Redemption Creek had opinions about Gerald Holt, and that those opinions were almost uniformly negative. Mabel told her, over strong black coffee and a piece of cornbread, that Gerald Holt had gone through 2 mail-order brides before Theresa, that neither of them had stayed more than a month, and that the second one had left with a bruise on her jaw that the whole town had quietly pretended not to see. Theresa had closed her hands around her coffee cup and said nothing. Mabel had looked at her steadily and said, "He is going to come looking for you. He is that kind of man." "I know," said Theresa. "When he does," said Mabel, "you should talk to the sheriff." Theresa had looked up then, her eyes guarded, and she had said something that would prove to be the most accurate forecast of her own emotional state. "I do not expect much from officials." She had reason for that expectation. In St. Louis, officials had been of no use to her whatsoever when it came to Edward Crane. Edward Crane had been a well-dressed, well-connected man, a junior partner in a legal firm, who had come into Theresa's life 3 years prior as a customer of the garment house where she worked. He had been charming in the beginning, attentive and generous, and Theresa, who had been lonely in a bone-deep way, had allowed herself to be courted by him. The courtship had lasted 4 months before the nature of his interest became clear. Edward Crane was a man who collected women the way other men collected property, convinced that possession was a form of affection. When Theresa had tried to end the relationship, he had not accepted it. He had come to her workplace. He had come to her rooming house. He had spoken to her landlord, who had increased her rent by an amount she could not afford as a quiet method of driving her out. He had gone to her employer and made insinuations about her character that had cost her her position. She had tried to file a complaint with the St. Louis Police Department. The officer she had spoken to had looked at Edward Crane's name on the piece of paper she offered, looked at Theresa, alone, without family, a seamstress from nowhere, and had told her that these were matters of the heart that he could not adjudicate. So when Mabel Higgins said talk to the sheriff, Theresa had folded that advice into the back of her mind the way you fold something you do not think you will need but cannot bring yourself to throw away. She had spent the morning in Mabel's store, helping to arrange a shipment of dry goods in exchange for the cornbread and coffee. By noon, Mabel had offered her the use of the small back room above the store, where delivery clerks sometimes stayed, for a few days while she found her footing. Theresa had accepted with a gratitude that felt almost painful in its size. By 4 in the afternoon, Gerald Holt's wagon had rattled down the main street of Redemption Creek. Theresa heard it from the window of the back room. She recognized the sound of those particular wheels, a slightly uneven rhythm from a cracked rear axle, and her whole body went cold. She heard his voice below, thick with the manufactured authority of a man who was used to getting what he wanted through sheer volume. She could not make out the words, but she could hear the register, the particular tone of a man who believed he owned something that had gotten away from him. Then she heard another voice, quieter, absolutely level, the kind of voice that did not need volume because it had something else, something that came from a different place than anger. She heard Gerald Holt's voice go up a note, then drop. Then the sound of the wagon pulling away. She came downstairs slowly. Mabel was standing behind the counter with her arms folded and an expression of restrained satisfaction. Standing in the doorway, blocking most of the light, was a man Theresa had not yet seen. He was tall, though not outlandishly so, perhaps 6 feet, with the lean build of someone who spent a great deal of time in the saddle. He had dark hair that needed cutting, worn under a hat he had not removed when he came inside the store, and a face that was weathered in the way of the territory rather than the city, fine lines around the eyes from squinting against a perpetual sun. He was perhaps 30 or 32, somewhere in that territory where a man has stopped being young without yet becoming old. He wore a badge on his coat, a simple tin star, the kind issued to lawmen throughout the territory. He was looking at Theresa with a directness that was neither hostile nor unkind. It was simply attentive, the gaze of a man who paid careful attention to what was in front of him. "You would be the woman Holt is looking for," he said, not an accusation, a fact offered plainly. "Theresa Townsend," she said before she could decide whether or not to confirm it. Her own name came out of her mouth like a small act of defiance, fully stated, nothing hidden. "Wallace Winslow," he said. "I am the sheriff here." He looked at Mabel briefly, then back at Theresa. "Holt says you had an agreement." "He is mistaken," Theresa said. "That is more or less what I told him," Wallace said. She blinked. "You took my side without hearing anything from me." Wallace Winslow considered that for a moment. Then he said, "A man who speaks about a woman the way he was speaking just now does not earn the benefit of the doubt. Mabel knows this town and she let you in her back room. That carries weight with me." He adjusted the brim of his hat. "He will likely try again. Do you have somewhere you are settled?" "Not precisely," Theresa said. He nodded, as though this was a piece of information he would now use rather than file away. "Mabel," he said, "I will check in this evening," and he had gone. Theresa had stood watching the door he had walked out of and tried to locate the shape of what had just happened, because it did not conform to any version of events she had been trained to expect. Gerald Holt did try again. He came back 2 days later, this time with a man from his property, a large and sullen hand named Cruz, and this time his manner had shifted from manufactured authority to something uglier and more direct. He had come to the store when Theresa was inside helping Mabel, and he had stated, flat and hard, that Theresa owed him for the stage fare he had paid to get her to Redemption Creek, and that she could pay that debt in work on his property. It was a transparent construction. The stage fare had been nothing of the sort Theresa had paid her own passage, but it was the kind of construction that was designed to have legal-sounding weight, the kind that had always worked on women who were alone and without recourse, except that Wallace Winslow was in the store. He had come in 10 minutes earlier, ostensibly to ask Mabel about a shipment of rifle cartridges that was expected, and he had been standing near the back when Holt pushed through the door with Cruz at his shoulder. What followed was brief and entirely controlled. Wallace had not raised his voice. He had stood between Theresa and Gerald Holt as naturally as though he had simply stepped to that side of the room on a whim, and he had asked Gerald Holt to produce documentation of any financial claim he had against Miss Townsend. Gerald Holt had none. Wallace had then reminded Gerald Holt that New Mexico territory law did not recognize debt based on an unwritten and informal arrangement, and that any further attempts to compel Miss Townsend's presence on his property would be treated as a matter for the territorial court. Gerald Holt had gone a deep, unpleasant red. He had looked past Wallace at Theresa with eyes full of the particular fury of a man who is used to winning, and he had said something low and ugly under his breath. Wallace Winslow had taken one step forward without touching Holt and said, quietly and with total finality, "Take your man and go home, Gerald." They went. That evening, Mabel Higgins had closed the store at 6 and brought out a bottle of blackberry wine she kept for special occasions and poured 2 glasses, one for herself and one for Theresa, and she had said, "Wallace Winslow is not what most men are." Theresa had turned her wine glass in her hands and said, "He does not seem to be." "His father was the sheriff before him," Mabel said. "Died in service when Wallace was 19. Wallace came back from working cattle up in Colorado, took the badge, been wearing it since. He is 29 now, been sheriff nearly 10 years. He is not married," Theresa asked, and then immediately wished she had not because the question arrived with more interest in its tone than she had intended. Mabel smiled into her wine glass. "He was engaged once, a woman named Cecilia. She went back east 4 years ago, said the territory was not what she had wanted." Mabel set down her glass. "I do not think Wallace was particularly surprised." Theresa went to bed that night in the small back room, listening to the wind move across the territory, and tried not to think about Wallace Winslow's eyes, which were a clear and patient gray. It was not easy. The days settled into something resembling a rhythm. Mabel paid Theresa in room, board, and a small wage to help in the store, which suited them both. Theresa proved to be quick with figures, and Mabel proved to have a strong dislike for keeping the books, so the arrangement deepened naturally into something more permanent. The other women in Redemption Creek, and there were not many, perhaps 30 in the whole of the town, came to know her slowly, the way women in small towns always come to know newcomers, through proximity, through the gradual accumulation of small shared tasks, through the organic weave of community that forms when people depend on each other for survival. She met Dolores Reyes, who ran the small laundry at the south end of town with her husband, Miguel, and who had 3 children under the age of 8 that she managed with a cheerful ferocity. She met Harriet Bloom, who was the wife of the town's one doctor, a quiet woman who read voraciously and whose shelves Theresa was occasionally invited to borrow from, which was among the greatest gifts she had received in years. She met June Aldercott, the schoolteacher, sharp and funny and 24, who had come from Ohio, and who said she intended to stay in the territory until she had done something worth writing about. These women formed the scaffolding of Theresa's new life, and within 3 weeks of arriving in Redemption Creek, she could feel herself beginning to breathe in a different way, a wider way. The kind of breathing that happens when you stop expecting an emergency at every corner. But the shadow of her dark past had not entirely lifted, because there was still Edward Crane. And while the distance between St. Louis and the New Mexico territory was considerable, Theresa knew from hard experience that Edward Crane was not a man who accepted the conclusion of anything on someone else's terms. She had not heard from him. But she had also not told anyone in Redemption Creek about him, because telling someone meant explaining, and explaining meant trusting someone with a vulnerability she was not ready to offer. It was on a Wednesday evening in early November, nearly 4 weeks after her arrival, that Wallace Winslow came into the store just before closing time. She was alone. Mabel had gone to take supper with Harriet Bloom, and Theresa had stayed to lock up, the ordinary task she had claimed as part of her daily rhythm. She was counting the day's receipts at the counter when she heard the door open and looked up to find Wallace stepping inside, removing his hat. "Miss Townsend," he said. "Mabel around?" "She is at the Blooms for supper," Theresa said. He nodded. "I have a question about a shipment that arrived today, but it can wait." He made no immediate move to leave. The oil lamp on the counter was the only light, and it put amber edges on everything, on his face and on the jars of preserves on the shelf behind him, on the slight uncertainty in his posture that she had not seen in him before. "Is there something else?" she asked. "I was going to walk down to Hannigan's for supper," he said. Hannigan's was the saloon that also served food, the closest thing Redemption Creek had to a restaurant. "I was wondering if you had eaten." She had not. She had been intending to heat the last of the bean soup Mabel had left on the stove upstairs, which was a thin and uninspiring prospect. "I have not," she said. "Then," he said, with a carefully casual quality to his voice that told her the casualness was deliberate, and therefore that the question was not casual at all, "would you care to walk down with me?" She looked at him for a moment across the counter, this man who had twice placed himself between her and Gerald Holt with no obligation to do so, this man with the patient gray eyes and the worn tin star, and she said, "All right." Hannigan's was warm and loud, smelling of wood smoke and roasting meat and the sharp edge of whiskey. Frank Hannigan, who ran the place with his wife, Opal, seated them at a table near the back, away from the gambling tables where 3 cowboys were engaged in a low-stakes card game, and a conversation that seemed to involve a great deal of profanity. They ordered the evening meal, which was beef stew and cornbread, and Wallace asked for coffee and Theresa asked for the same, and they sat in the way of 2 people who are not quite sure how to begin a conversation they have been circling for some time. "How are you finding Redemption Creek?" Wallace asked. "Better than I expected to find it," Theresa said honestly. "Where were you before?" "St. Louis." He considered that. "Long way to come." "Yes," she said. He did not ask the obvious follow-up question, which was why, or what had brought her to answer a mail-order advertisement in the first place. He simply waited. In that way he had that particular stillness that was the opposite of pressure. It occurred to Theresa that she had never once been in the presence of a man whose silences were restful. She said before she fully intended to, "I was trying to get away from something." "Most people who come out here are," Wallace said. "Was that true for you?" He looked slightly surprised, which told her he was not often asked questions about himself. "I came back," he said. "I was born here. Left at 17, worked up north, came back when my father died." He turned his coffee cup once in its saucer. "I suppose I was trying to finish something rather than escape it." "What were you finishing?" His eyes met hers directly. "His work," he said simply. The food arrived and they ate, and the conversation moved through easier territories: the town, the cattle trade, the hard winter that everyone was predicting, the new school addition that June Aldercott was trying to get funded. Wallace was dry and quiet, funny, in a way that was nothing like the performed charm of Edward Crane, nothing like the manufactured warmth of a man who wanted something. He was simply himself, and himself was good company. They were nearly finished when Gerald Holt came in. He was not alone. He had Cruz with him again, and a third man Theresa did not recognize, and he had been drinking before he arrived, which was evident in the elevated quality of his agitation. He saw Theresa and Wallace at the corner table, and something hardened and heated in his face. Theresa felt the cold flood through her that she always felt in these moments, that trained response of a woman who has learned to assess danger. Wallace had already seen him. He had, Theresa noticed, a capacity for peripheral awareness that was almost eerie in its completeness. He did not look at Holt directly. He simply set down his coffee cup and said to Theresa very quietly, "Finish your cornbread. He is not going to make a scene." "How do you know?" she asked. "Because Frank Hannigan is standing behind the bar with his hand under the counter," Wallace said, "and everybody in this room knows what Frank keeps under that counter." Theresa took a breath and finished her cornbread. Gerald Holt crossed the room and stopped at their table. He had enough sobriety left to speak in a voice that was low rather than shouted, but the control cost him something and it showed. "You are making a fool of me," he said to Theresa. "Mr. Holt," Wallace said pleasantly, "you are welcome to sit somewhere in this establishment and have your supper. If you have legal business with anyone in this room, you may come to my office in the morning, but you are not going to stand at this table and address Miss Townsend in that manner." "She signed nothing," Gerald Holt said, and it was not clear whether he was making a concession or an accusation. "No," said Wallace, "she did not." Gerald Holt stood there for a moment that stretched, and then Cruz put a hand on his arm and said something quiet, and they moved away to a table across the room. Theresa exhaled. Wallace watched her do it. Then he said, "He is going to go on being difficult for a while. Men like that require a longer adjustment period." "I have some experience with men like that," Theresa said, and the words came out with an edge she had not entirely intended. Wallace caught it. She could see that he had, but he did not pull at it. He simply said, "You do not have to carry that alone if you decide you do not want to." It was such a careful and precise offer, touching nothing she had not yet chosen to give, that it stopped her breath for a moment. She said, "I will keep that in mind." He walked her back to the store afterward, in the cool October dark, the stars enormous and unpolluted over the territory. And when they reached the door he said, "Thank you for the company, Miss Townsend." And she said, "Thank you for the supper, Sheriff Winslow." And they each went inside their respective doors, and Theresa lay awake in her narrow bed for 2 hours trying to be reasonable about the warmth that had taken up residence in the center of her chest. She had not come to the New Mexico territory to develop feelings for a man. She had come to find somewhere she could stand without being in danger. She had come to put distance between herself and her dark past. She had not come for this, whatever this was, this quiet and devastating gravity that pulled her toward a man with gray eyes and a patient voice, and a badge on his coat. She tried, in the logical part of her mind, to list the reasons this was a poor idea. She was 26 years old and already had one near-catastrophic judgment call behind her in the person of Gerald Holt, and another full-scale disaster behind that in the person of Edward Crane, and perhaps she was simply not the kind of woman who made sensible choices about men. But then she remembered the chair, the pulled chair. The simple, wordless invitation that had said, without pressure or performance, "I see that you are standing and I would like you to be comfortable, and I am offering you that without requiring anything in return." She pressed her hands against her face in the dark and made a small, helpless sound. She was, she feared, in a very great deal of trouble. November in the New Mexico territory was cold and golden, and occasionally struck through with winds that came down from the mountains with the temperature of iron. Theresa bought a heavier coat from Mabel's store at employee cost, and learned to bank the fire in the room properly, so that it held heat through the night. She began to feel, in a way she had not felt since before her parents died, that she was in a place rather than merely passing through one. She had supper with Wallace Winslow 3 more times in that first month, twice at Hannigan's, and once at the kitchen table of the sheriff's office, when Opal Hannigan had sent over a pot of chicken and dumplings, and Wallace had been in the middle of reviewing territorial warrant papers. He had offered without ceremony. She had accepted without pretense, and they had eaten together while he worked, and she read one of Harriet Bloom's books, and it was the most companionable evening Theresa could remember in her adult life. They talked about everything and nothing in the way of two people who are becoming friends, and who are slowly, carefully, becoming aware that friendship may not be the correct word for what is actually happening between them. They talked about books, which Wallace read when he had time, mostly history, and occasionally the novels that circulated through Redemption Creek from hand to hand, passed from Harriet to June to Dollars, and eventually to anyone who wanted them. They talked about the territory, its politics and its geography, and the complicated injustice of the way the Mescalero Apache people had been pushed onto restricted land, a subject on which Wallace held clear opinions that surprised her with their fairness. They talked about the cattle trade and the coming railroad and what Redemption Creek might look like in 10 years. They did not talk about the hidden things. Not yet. Theresa knew she was holding back. She knew, in that particular way of a woman who has been forced to be self-aware by necessity, that she was giving Wallace access to the surface of herself while keeping the deeper country carefully locked. She was not dishonest. She simply was not yet brave enough to be fully honest, which is a different thing. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late November. It came with the regular mail delivery, addressed to Theresa Townsend, care of Higgins General Store, Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory. The handwriting on the envelope was distinctive, precise, slightly angular, the handwriting of a man who had been educated to believe that precision was a mark of power. She recognized it before she fully processed the name on the return address. Edward Crane, St. Louis, Missouri. She sat down on the stool behind the counter with the letter in her hands and did not open it for several minutes. Mabel came in from the back and saw her face and said quietly, "What is it?" "Someone found me," Theresa said. She opened the letter. It was 3 pages, dense and methodical, written in the particular language of a man who has spent time among lawyers and has absorbed their idiom as a tool for control. Edward Crane wrote that he had learned, through various inquiries, of her whereabouts. He wrote that he had business that required her return to St. Louis. He wrote, in terms just careful enough to be deniable but clear enough to be understood, that he intended to come to Redemption Creek personally if she did not respond. She read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases and put it in her coat pocket. Mabel had not moved. "Theresa," she said, "who is this person?" Theresa looked at Mabel's sharp, steady face and made a decision. She told her. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Edward Crane, St. Louis, the 3 years of accumulated harassment and intimidation, and the institutional abandonment that had made it possible for him to do what he had done without consequence. She told Mabel about the lost job, the impossible rent, the police officer who had looked at Edward Crane's name and decided it was not his problem. Mabel listened without interruption. When Theresa finished, Mabel said, "You need to tell Wallace." "I know," Theresa said. "Today," Mabel said. "I know," Theresa said again. She went to the sheriff's office that afternoon. Wallace was at his desk, which was its usual state of organized disorder, papers and warrants, and a large territorial map on the wall behind him, a rifle in the rack by the door, a pot of coffee perpetually on the small iron stove in the corner. He looked up when she came in, and his face did that thing it did, which was become slightly more present, slightly more focused, which was the way his face indicated attention. "Theresa," he said. He had started using her given name in the past 2 weeks, and she had started using his, and neither of them had made any comment about this transition. She came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she had come to think of as her chair, and she put Edward Crane's letter on the desk between them. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I should have told you sooner. I kept it back because I have learned to be cautious about what I tell officials, and I am sorry for that." Wallace looked at the letter, then at her. "Tell me," he said, so she told him, all of it this time. Everything she had told Mabel and the pieces she had held back even then, the way it had begun with apparent gentleness, the way it had turned, the specific ways Edward Crane had dismantled her life from the outside with connections and money, and the particular kind of social power that could make a woman invisible. The police officer, the landlord, the garment house where she had lost her position. Wallace listened without interruption. His face was very still, but she could see something moving underneath the stillness, not anger, or not only anger, but something more complicated, something that looked like the recognition of a deep injustice being processed by a man who had strong feelings about injustice. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the letter and read it. "He is coming," Wallace said. "That is what this says underneath all the formal language. He is coming here." "Yes," she said. "All right," Wallace said. He set the letter down. His jaw had a set to it that she had not seen before, something absolute and quiet. "He is not the law. He has no authority here. If he comes to Redemption Creek, I will know about it immediately, and he will quickly understand that this town does not operate the way he is accustomed to things operating." Theresa looked at him. "You cannot promise that he will not find a way to make trouble. He is very good at finding ways." "He has never been in a place where I am the sheriff," Wallace said. It was not boasting. It was a statement of territory, of jurisdiction. Not his personal jurisdiction, but the jurisdiction of a different kind of law than Edward Crane had ever dealt with. Theresa felt something shift in her chest. "Wallace," she said, "I did not come here to bring trouble into this town." "You came here to be safe," he said. "That is a reasonable thing to want." He looked at her directly, the full weight of those gray eyes, steady as iron. "You are going to be safe." She had not cried in Redemption Creek. She had not cried, in fact, in a very long time, because she had learned that crying was a luxury she could not afford when she needed all her resources for more immediate things. But something in the simple declarative certainty of those 5 words, "You are going to be safe," came very close to undoing that discipline. She pressed her lips together and looked at the territorial map on the wall behind his head and made herself breathe. "Thank you," she managed. "Do not thank me yet," he said, with something almost like lightness in his voice. "Send me word the moment you hear anything further." She stood to go. She had reached the door when he said, "Theresa." She turned. He was still at his desk, the letter in front of him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something unguarded, something that lived beneath the steadiness and the quiet authority, something that was entirely personal. "I am glad you came to Redemption Creek," he said. She stood with her hand on the door frame, and the whole of the New Mexico territory stretched out behind her in the afternoon light, and she said, "So am I," and meant it in more directions than she could comfortably acknowledge. The next 2 weeks were a period of suspended waiting, the particular anxiety of knowing something is coming without knowing precisely when it will arrive. Theresa went about her work with the focused efficiency of a woman who is using productivity as a bulwark against fear. She kept the store books with meticulous care. She helped June Aldercott with the school supply inventory. She had Sunday dinner at Dolores Reyes's house and played a card game she did not know with Dolores' husband Miguel and laughed more than she expected to. She had supper with Wallace twice more. The conversation between them had deepened, which was not something she had fully prepared for. She had expected the disclosure of her history to create a kind of professional distance, the distance of lawman and citizen, but instead it had done the opposite. It had cleared away a layer of careful performance and left something more real underneath. He had told her, over coffee one evening at Hannigan's, about his father. About coming back to the territory to find his father had died badly shot during a routine dispute that had turned ugly, and about the specific grief of learning, at 19, that the man you had planned to have more time with was already gone. About how he had spent 6 months on the Winslow homestead with his mother before taking the badge and moving into the sheriff's office, which was smaller and bleaker than it now appeared, because he had gradually made it more livable over 10 years. He told her about the engagement to Cecilia, not with bitterness, but with a kind of honest assessment of his own culpability in its failure. He said he had been young and certain and wrong about some important things, and that Cecilia had been right to go back east if east was where she needed to be. Theresa had said carefully, "Do you think she was right to leave?" "I think she was right to know what she needed," Wallace said. "I think I would have been wrong to expect her to want something she did not want just because I wanted it." He looked at his coffee cup. "The territory is not for everyone. Is it for me?" Theresa asked, and then felt the boldness of the question and wished she could pull it back. But Wallace looked at her without surprise, as though it was exactly the question he had been expecting. "You have been here 6 weeks," he said, "and you already know more about what is happening in this town than some people who have lived here for 20 years. He paused. "The territory does not ask if you belong to it. You either stay or you do not. It is an honest bargain." "I think I want to stay," she said, and this time she did not qualify it or look away. Something warm and entirely unguarded moved across his face there and then carefully composed again. "Good," he said. Edward Crane arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in December on the southbound stage from Santa Fe, and he did not look like what he was. He never had. That was always the difficulty with Edward Crane. He looked like exactly what he presented himself as. A professional man, well-dressed, well-groomed, utterly unremarkable in the manner that people associate with respectability. He was 43 years old, of medium height, with a pleasant enough face and the bearing of a man who expected deference. He wore a good coat and carried a leather satchel, and when he stepped off the stage in Redemption Creek, he looked around the town with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere beneath his station and intends not to let it trouble him unduly. Theresa saw him from the window of the store before he saw her. The cold shock of recognition was immediate and physical. Her hands went to the counter's edge and gripped it. She had exactly enough time to think clearly before the fear settled into something more manageable. She thought, "Wallace knows he is coming." She thought, "I am not in St. Louis. I am not alone." She went to the door of the store and turned the lock, and then she went to the back and up the stairs to the small room and sat on the bed with her hands clasped and waited. It took Edward Crane 20 minutes to locate where she was staying, which meant someone at the stage depot had directed him without any great reluctance. Small towns talked. She had known this. She heard him on the stairs, those precise and deliberate footsteps, and she heard him knock on the door of the room, and she did not open it. "Theresa," he said through the door, "I have come a very long way." "You should go back the same distance," she said. "I have business to discuss," he said. "It concerns your sister's estate." This was new. This was a tactic she had not anticipated, and the fact that she had not anticipated it frightened her more than anything he had actually said, because it meant his inventiveness had not diminished. "Clara had no estate," she said. "She died with nothing." "There is a matter with the garment house where she was employed," Edward Crane said. "Wages owed. I am acting as legal representative on the matter." A pause. "You should hear this, Theresa. I would not have come so far for nothing." It was, she recognized with cold clarity, a trap. The legal language was designed to compel her to engage, because in her experience the failure to engage with legal matters had consequences. But the nature of the trap was cleaner and more detached than his previous methods, which meant something had changed in him or in his calculations. She did not open the door. She heard the sound of boots on the stairs, different boots, the particular rhythm she had learned to identify over 6 weeks of paying attention. Then she heard Wallace's voice, entirely calm. "Mr. Crane," he said, "I am Sheriff Wallace Winslow. I would ask you to step away from that door." There was a pause. "I have legal business with the woman inside," Edward Crane said. "If you have legal business in Redemption Creek," Wallace said, "you may present it at my office where we can review the documentation properly. That is how legal business is conducted in this jurisdiction, not in the private rooms of a private residence." Another pause. Longer this time. "I see," Edward Crane said. "I am glad," said Wallace. "The stage back to Santa Fe leaves Thursday morning at 7. I recommend you spend your time in Redemption Creek at Hannigan's or at the hotel, which is next to the stage depot. I will be happy to escort you to the hotel right now." He was not asking. Theresa listened to the footsteps retreat down the stairs, 2 sets of them, and she sat on the bed in the small back room above the general store, and the tears that had been accumulating for 6 weeks finally came, not in grief, but in something much more complicated, relief and gratitude and fury at the years she had spent being afraid of a man whose only real power was his confidence that no one would stop him. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up and went downstairs. Wallace came back 20 minutes later. He knocked on the store door and she unlocked it and let him in. He looked at her face and said nothing about the evidence of crying. "He is at the hotel," Wallace said. "I checked his documentation. He is a licensed attorney from Missouri, but his claim regarding your sister's estate is thin, very thin. I sent a telegraph to the territorial court in Santa Fe, and I have a colleague there who will verify by morning whether there is any legitimate claim on record." "There is not," Theresa said. "I expect you are right," Wallace said, "but I want the paper trail." He looked at her steadily. "How are you?" "I am angry," she said. "Good," he said. "Angry is better than afraid." "I am also afraid," she admitted. "That is also reasonable," he said. He stayed in the store that evening. Not hovering, not performing protection, but simply present, sitting at the counter with his own paperwork, while Mabel came back and made tea, and the three of them occupied the space with the comfortable practicality of people who have decided on a course of action and are waiting for it to unfold. Edward Crane's documentation, as Wallace had predicted, revealed nothing substantive. The telegraph from Santa Fe confirmed that there was no legal claim registered in any territorial court concerning Clara Townsend's wages or estate. When Edward Crane came to the sheriff's office the following morning, immaculate and composed, to discuss the matter, Wallace showed him the telegraph and told him, with full and unambiguous courtesy, that there was nothing to support his continued presence in Redemption Creek, and that any further contact with Miss Townsend, in any form, would be treated as harassment and reported to the Missouri Bar Association. Edward Crane had sat across from Wallace Winslow's desk for several minutes, with the expression of a man recalculating. He was not accustomed to this, the calm, absolute, institutional wall of a lawman who was also intelligent enough to understand exactly what he was doing and prepared enough to have the documentation to prove it. He left on the Thursday morning stage. Theresa watched it go from the window of the store, and she watched it until it was entirely out of sight, and then she turned around and went back to the counter and picked up the ledger and went back to the numbers. Mabel put a cup of tea at her elbow and said nothing. Wallace came by that afternoon briefly and said that he had sent a telegraph to a contact in St. Louis and that if Edward Crane attempted any further communication he would involve federal authorities. He said it in the matter-of-fact way he had, as though this were simply the next logical step in a process, and Theresa looked at him across the store counter and said, "Wallace." He looked at her. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay," she said. "You do not owe me anything," he said, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by the suggestion, which told her something essential about the way he understood himself in relation to other people. "I do," she said, "not legally, but in the way that actually matters." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the store's front window at a low winter angle, catching the dust motes and making everything slightly golden. He was wearing his coat but not his hat, having come from his office just down the street, and without the hat his face was slightly more open, slightly more visible. "Then pay it forward," he said quietly. "When someone needs what you needed and you can give it." She held his gaze. "That is an elegant answer," she said. "I have my moments," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way it did, the almost smile that she had become highly attuned to. She wanted, with a specificity that surprised her, to close the distance between them. She wanted to put her hand against his jaw, to feel if his face was as warm as it looked in the winter light. She wanted to tell him things she had not told anyone, not Mabel, not June, not Dolores, things about how she had arrived in Redemption Creek with nothing and had somehow found herself with more than she had ever expected to have, and that the shape of that unexpected abundance looked more and more like him. She did not say any of these things. She was not yet brave enough. But she was getting there. Christmas in Redemption Creek was modest and genuine in the way of frontier celebrations. The community came together at the church, which was a small whitewashed building at the north end of town, for a service that was followed by a communal dinner in the schoolhouse, which June Aldercott organized with military precision. Everyone brought something. Theresa brought 2 pies she had made in Mabel's kitchen, apple and dried plum, and she sat with Dolores and her children and felt the extraordinary, fragile warmth of belonging somewhere. Wallace sat across the long table from her, between Frank Hannigan and the town's doctor, Everett Bloom, and they caught each other's eyes more than once across the noise and the candlelight and the warmth of 40-something people sharing a meal in December. And each time the eye contact lasted a beat too long to be accidental and a beat too brief to be resolved. It was June Aldercott who was direct about it, because June Aldercott was always direct. She came and sat beside Theresa during the dessert portion of the evening and said, without any preamble at all, "When are you going to tell him?" Theresa turned her head and said, "Tell who what?" June gave her the look of a schoolteacher confronting an inadequate answer. "Theresa, I am 24 and I have been in this town for 3 years and I have never once seen Wallace Winslow look at someone the way he looks at you." She picked up a piece of Theresa's dried plum pie. "This is excellent, by the way." "Thank you," Theresa said. "Just tell him," June said, "or allow yourself to be told. One of the two needs to happen before spring or the whole town is going to lose their minds." Theresa looked across the table at Wallace, who was laughing at something Everett Bloom had said. His head tipped back slightly, the full and unself-conscious laugh of a man in a moment of genuine ease, and she thought, "I have been afraid for so long that I have forgotten how to simply want something." She allowed herself, in the warmth of the schoolhouse, with the pie and the candlelight and the sound of children running between the tables, to want something. She wanted Wallace Winslow. She wanted the life that was beginning to take shape in Redemption Creek. She wanted to stop being afraid and start being present in the existence she was actually living. It was terrifying, and it felt, for the first time in a very long time, exactly right. The new year of 1883 arrived with a blizzard that shut Redemption Creek in for 4 days. The snow was extraordinary by local standards, 2 feet on the flat, more where the wind had drifted it against the buildings, and a cold that bit through even the heaviest coat. The town hunkered down and managed, as frontier towns always managed, with the pragmatic efficiency of people who have survived difficult seasons before. Theresa spent the first 2 days helping Mabel inventory the store's winter supplies and helping Dolores with her children, who had been kept indoors and were expressing their frustration with the passionate energy of small children everywhere. On the 3rd day, when the snow had eased to a light drift and the paths between the main buildings had been cleared enough to navigate, she put on her coat and her heavy boots and walked through the white, silent cold to the sheriff's office. She had not planned it precisely. She had woken up on the 3rd day of the blizzard with the clear and simple knowledge that she was done with careful management of the distance between herself and what she wanted. Wallace was alone in the office. He had a fire going in the iron stove, and he was at his desk with a pot of coffee and a report he was writing with the particular concentration of a man who dislikes paperwork but understands its necessity. He looked up when she came in, and his face did that thing it always did. "Theresa," he said, "is everything all right?" "Yes," she said. "I wanted to talk to you about something." She sat down in her chair across from his desk. She unwound her scarf. She looked at him directly. "I am not accustomed to people who do not want something from me," she said. "Every person I have dealt with in my adult life has wanted something: labor, compliance, silence, company, money, whatever it was. No one has ever done the things you have done without wanting something in return." Wallace was very still. "I have been waiting," she continued, "for what you want. I have been waiting for the moment when the kindness turned into the thing it was always covering. Because that has been my experience consistently, without exception." She paused. "But you keep not doing that, and it has taken me a long time to understand that it might simply be because that is not how you are built." "It is not," he said. "I know that now," she said. "And I wanted to say it plainly because you deserve to have it said plainly rather than implied. You are the first person I have encountered in a very long time who has been purely kind. Not transactionally kind, just kind. He looked at her for a long moment. "Theresa," he said, and his voice had something different in it, something warmer and less guarded. "I am not finished," she said, because she had not gathered this courage for nothing. "I am also telling you this because I believe you have feelings for me that go beyond concern for a citizen of this town. And I believe I have feelings for you that go considerably beyond gratitude." She held his gaze. "And I have spent my whole adult life being too afraid to be honest about what I want, and I am done with that." The silence that followed was 2 or 3 seconds long, but it had the density of something much longer. Wallace stood up. He came around the desk, unhurried, and he stopped in front of her chair, close but not crowding, still giving her the space she had always needed, and he said, "I was going to tell you at some point. I was trying to be careful with it. I did not want to crowd you when you were already dealing with—" "I know," she said. "You were being careful. You are always careful with me. I see it and I am grateful for it. But I do not need careful anymore. I need honest." He held out his hand, palm up, the simplest possible gesture. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth of it went all the way up her arm and settled somewhere in the region of her chest. And she looked up at him, and he looked down at her. And there, it was, the thing that had been building since the first evening he had offered her supper at Hannigan's. Since the first time he had stood between her and Gerald Holt without being asked. Since the very first moment she had walked into Mabel's store, and he had taken care of a situation without needing to make it about himself. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the 3rd time you corrected Mabel's ledger while I was trying to discuss a cartridge shipment, and you did not even look up from the page." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, but she did, and it was a real laugh, full and unheld, and he smiled at it in a way that was entirely unguarded. And then she stood up from the chair, and he was right there, and she kissed him. It was a proper kiss, held and real, his hand coming up to her jaw with a gentleness that was nevertheless entirely sure of itself, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Not managed, not performed, not negotiated. This. They stood there in the sheriff's office in the middle of a blizzard, with the fire going in the iron stove and the snow piling up against the windows, and when they finally stepped back from each other, they were both slightly breathless, and the warmth between them was something that had nothing to do with the fire. "All right," Wallace said. "All right," she agreed. "I would like to court you properly," he said, which was so entirely like him, the man who believed in doing things correctly and honestly and in order, that she laughed again. "I believe you have been doing that for 2 months already," she said. "I want to do it with intent," he said. "Out in the open. I want the town to know." "June Aldercott has already informed half the town," Theresa said. He blinked. "She has. She told me at Christmas that the whole town was losing its mind waiting for us to resolve this," Theresa said. He processed this. "I see," he said. "June Aldercott is efficient." "She is," Theresa agreed. He raised her hand, still held in his, and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture so formal and so warm simultaneously that she felt it in her throat. "Theresa Townsend," he said, "would you allow me to court you with official and declared intent?" "Wallace Winslow," she said, "I absolutely would." The courtship was everything that June Aldercott had predicted the town would enjoy, which was to say that it was genuinely warm and completely apparent, and Redemption Creek responded to it with the enthusiastic approval of a community that had watched Wallace Winslow be alone for a very long time and was glad to see the end of it. Mabel Higgins took full credit for all of it, which Theresa allowed because Mabel had, in fact, played a significant role by simply being the kind of person who opened her door to a woman sitting on her boardwalk in the early morning. Wallace brought her flowers in February, which in the territory in winter meant a small bunch of dried desert flowers from the supply at the general store, which Theresa thought was possibly the most endearing thing she had ever witnessed. A man in a sheriff's badge buying dried flowers from the store where she worked, which she then received as a gift, having sold them to him herself. They walked together on Sunday afternoons, when the weather permitted, out past the edge of town where the desert opened up and the sky became enormous. They talked about everything. He told her about his childhood in the territory, about learning to track cattle with his father, and how those same skills had become useful in a different way as sheriff. She told him about her parents, who had been good people taken too early, and about Clara, who had been kind and funny, and who had died at 28 of typhoid in a rooming house 3 streets from where Theresa lived, and whose death Theresa had not had enough time to grieve because grief was a luxury she had not been able to afford. Wallace listened to all of it with that quality of his that she had come to understand was a genuine gift, the capacity to receive someone else's experience without reshaping it, without offering it back to them in a tidier form, but simply holding it as it was. She began to understand over the course of those winter months that she had been waiting for exactly this without knowing that was what she was waiting for. Not rescue, not safety in the transactional sense, but partnership, the specific and rare thing of someone who stood beside you because they wanted to, who offered their strength without requiring yours in exchange, who made a space at the table and pulled out the chair and waited for you to decide if you wanted to sit. In March, he asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of the sheriff's office in the first warm evening of the year, with the desert air carrying the smell of sage and the stars enormous and close overhead, and he said, "I have been trying to find the right moment for this, and I have concluded that there is no right moment. There is only the moment you decide to be honest." She turned her head to look at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build a life here with you, the kind where we are partners in the actual sense, not in the way it is sometimes said and not meant. I want your honesty and your intelligence and your laughter and the way you correct ledgers without looking up, and I want the hard parts too, because there will be hard parts and I would rather face them with you than without you." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the desert settle into night. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, I believe that is the word for what I mean," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned her head against his shoulder and the stars continued their enormous indifferent turning. And down below them, Redemption Creek breathed its nighttime breath. And Theresa Townsend felt, for the first time since she was 14 years old, entirely at home. They were married in the whitewashed church at the north end of town in April 1883. On a morning of the specific lucid blue that the territory produced in spring, the kind of sky that seemed closer than any sky in a city. The wedding was small and genuine. Mabel stood with Theresa, and Frank Hannigan stood with Wallace, and the minister, who was a sober and dignified man named Reverend Price, married them with the words that had been used for centuries but sounded, in that small sunlit church, entirely specific to the two people standing before him. June Aldercott cried, which she would have vigorously denied if pressed. Dolers brought her 3 children, who sat in the front pew with the seriousness of children who have been told to behave and are genuinely trying. The youngest, a boy of 4 named Louis, fell asleep during the vows, which everyone agreed was perfect. Theresa wore a dress she had made herself, from fabric she had chosen with Mabel, a deep blue-gray that was the color of Wallace's eyes, though she did not mention this as the reason for her selection. She carried the small bunch of dried desert flowers from February, which she had kept pressed between the pages of one of Harriet Bloom's books. Wallace wore his good coat, his badge, and an expression of transparent happiness that made even Reverend Price almost smile. When it was over, they walked out of the church into the April sun, husband and wife, and the small crowd of Redemption Creek threw handfuls of dried corn and cheered with the genuine warmth of a community that is actually glad about something. And Wallace took Theresa's hand in his and held it with the same certainty he had held it with in the sheriff's office during the blizzard, and she held back just as hard. They moved into the house that had been Wallace's mother's, which his mother had vacated 2 years prior to go live with her sister in Albuquerque. It was a proper adobe house, 4 rooms, with a front porch and a vegetable garden that had been lying fallow, and a wood stove in the kitchen that was efficient and good. Theresa spent a week cleaning and arranging it with the fierce, purposeful energy of a woman who is making a home for the first time in her adult life and intends to do it properly. She kept her hours at Mabel's store. They had agreed before the wedding that she would continue working, because she was good at it, and because Mabel needed her, and because Theresa was not the kind of woman who was suited to staying entirely at home when there was other useful work to do. Wallace had agreed to this with the immediate, uncomplicated yes of a man who had no interest in owning his wife's time. They navigated the ordinary complications of two people making a shared life, the discussions about money and the management of the household account, which they settled on jointly, the negotiations about which tasks belonged to whom and which were shared, the learning of each other's private habits, the ones you only discover when you share a house. Wallace, it turned out, sang to himself very quietly when he was working on reports, tuneless but enthusiastic. Theresa, it turned out, talked in her sleep occasionally, nothing coherent but animated. These discoveries were entirely delightful. Gerald Holt left Redemption Creek in May, his cattle operation having finally failed under the weight of poor management and debt. He sold his remaining stock at a loss and moved north, and no one in town mourned his departure. Theresa felt something release in her when she heard he had gone, a small remaining watchfulness that she had not been fully aware of carrying until it was no longer necessary. Summer was long and bright and full. Theresa learned the rhythm of the territory in the hot months, the early rising before the heat built, the afternoon shelter, the evening cool when you could sit on the porch and watch the light leave the sky in colors that no description ever quite captured. She learned the plants and the birds, the specific geology of the arroyos, the way a storm built on the mountain horizon, and the smell it brought on its front edge. She helped June Aldercott get the school edition funded, through a letter-writing campaign that Theresa organized with the methodical efficiency that Mabel said was going to be the economic engine of Redemption Creek, whether the town liked it or not. The edition was approved by the Territorial Board in July. Construction began in August, and June Aldercott celebrated with a bottle of wine at the Winslow house that she shared with Theresa and Wallace and Dolers, while Miguel took the children. Wallace solved 3 significant crimes that summer: a series of livestock thefts from a neighboring ranch, a matter of forged land deeds that turned out to involve a distant tentacle of a larger operation in Santa Fe, and a bar fight that escalated to something more serious but was managed without anyone dying, which Wallace cited as his preferred outcome. He was good at his work in the way of someone who has thought carefully about what the work actually requires of a person and has worked to become that person deliberately. Theresa watched him with the specific admiration of a woman who knows the difference between competence and character, and who has learned that both together are much rarer than either alone. In September, Theresa discovered she was pregnant. She told Wallace on a Saturday morning while they were sitting on the porch with coffee, watching the desert wake up in the early light. She had been carrying the knowledge for a week, turning it in her mind, feeling the weight of something enormous and tender. She said simply, "I am going to have a baby." Wallace put down his coffee cup. He looked at her with an expression that was too full for any single word: joy and wonder, and something she recognized as the particular seriousness of a man who understands that the world has just become larger in a way that carries responsibility. He said, "Theresa," she said, "I know." He reached over and took her hand. They sat with it for a while, the morning light growing and the birds doing their early business in the brush, and eventually he said, "Are you frightened?" "Yes," she said honestly, "and also very glad." "The same," he said. Harriet Bloom's husband Everett confirmed the pregnancy and said Theresa was in excellent health and could expect delivery in late spring. Harriet, who had been through this herself twice, and whose opinions on the matter were therefore both informed and practical, provided Theresa with a list of things she would need and a complete description of what to expect, delivered in the matter-of-fact language of a well-read woman who believed that information was the cure for most unnecessary fear. The town, when it became evident, responded with the particular warmth of a community that regards itself as a kind of extended family for everyone within it. Dolers brought food on a rotating schedule that was not requested but was entirely welcome. Mabel quietly adjusted Theresa's hours at the store for the months when the pregnancy was heaviest, and quietly unadjusted them when Theresa said she preferred to be busy. June came by on Thursday evenings because she said she liked the company, which everyone understood to mean that she was keeping an eye on things in her own brisk and caring way. Wallace was, Theresa thought, impossibly good at this. He did not smother. He did not hover in the anxious way of a man who does not trust the person he loves to manage themselves. He was simply present, attentive and steady, the same way he was present in everything, with the specific reliability of someone who has decided what kind of person to be and has become that person completely. He built a cradle in October, in the evenings after dinner, in the small shed behind the house. He was not a particularly skilled woodworker, which he acknowledged freely, and the cradle was not a piece of fine furniture. But it was solid and smooth and made with complete devotion, and when he brought it inside and set it in the corner of the bedroom, Theresa stood and looked at it for a long time. "It is very good," she said. "It leans slightly to the left," he said. "That will be fine," she said. "A slight lean builds character." He laughed, and she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands over the place where their child was growing, and the feeling that moved through her was something she had never had a word for, had never expected to have a word for, something that was made of gratitude and love and the specific, astonishing sensation of having arrived somewhere you did not know you were traveling toward. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was gentler than the previous year, and the town of Redemption Creek continued its own slow growth. A new blacksmith opened at the south end of town. A second dry goods store opened across from Mabel's. Mabel regarded this with competitive interest rather than alarm. And the school addition was completed and occupied in January, to June Aldercott's profound satisfaction. Theresa continued working through March, which some people felt was past the appropriate point, and did not particularly care what those people felt. She continued keeping the store books, which could be done sitting down and which kept her mind engaged and her sense of usefulness intact. She and Wallace talked about the baby in the evenings, on the porch when the weather allowed and by the wood stove when it did not. They talked about names, which took considerable time because they had different associations for almost every name they considered, and about the values they wanted to give a child, which was a conversation that went deep and serious and real, the way their conversations always eventually went. They talked about the kind of world they were building this child into the territory in 1884, the complexities and injustices of it, the particular weight of raising a child in a place where opportunity and hardship existed in equal measure, where the Apache people were living under conditions of profound injustice, where women's rights were circumscribed in ways that Theresa felt with personal urgency. Wallace listened to all of this with the full attention she had come to depend on, and he offered his own thinking in return. And they did not agree on every point, but they agreed on the ones that mattered, which is the way of two people who are genuinely suited to each other. Their son was born on the 23rd of May, 1884, in the early hours of the morning, with Harriet Bloom and Dolers Rays in attendance and Wallace in the next room wearing a path in the floorboards. He was healthy and loud and looked, Theresa thought, astonishingly like himself, an entirely distinct person who had arrived with his own specific face and his own specific set of opinions about the world, which he was expressing at considerable volume. Wallace came in and stood at the bedside and looked down at his son with an expression that contained an entire world. "Hello," he said to the baby, with great seriousness. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused but intense gaze of the newborn. "He has your eyes," Theresa said. "He has your stubbornness," Harriet Bloom said from across the room, which made Theresa laugh and wince simultaneously. They named him James Thomas Winslow, James for Wallace's father, Thomas for Theresa's. James Thomas Winslow turned out to have strong opinions and a loud voice, and a disposition that was pure determination wrapped in considerable charm, which Mabel Higgins said was entirely predictable given his parentage. The first year of James's life rearranged everything in the way that first children always do, remapping priorities, reorganizing time, introducing a category of exhausted tenderness that neither Theresa nor Wallace had known existed before it arrived. They managed it the way they managed everything, with the practical division of people who trust each other and are willing to be honest about their limits. Theresa returned to the store when James was 3 months old, bringing him with her in the mornings in a wooden carrier that Dolers had made, and Mabel took to him with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a woman who had always wanted grandchildren and had gotten a store instead. Wallace carried James in the evenings after dinner, walking the length of the porch with the baby against his chest, both of them watching the desert go dark, and sometimes Theresa watched them from the doorway and thought, "This is the exact shape of the life I did not know I was hoping for." Gerald Holt, she learned in the summer of 1884, had settled up north near Taos and had apparently managed to lose his remaining money in a mining venture that had gone sour. She felt nothing about this beyond the distant satisfaction of a wrong that had corrected itself by ordinary means. Edward Crane she heard nothing of, which was the best possible outcome. Wallace's contact instant. Louis sent a brief report in October 1884 indicating that Crane had left his legal firm under somewhat unclear circumstances and had relocated to Chicago. Theresa read the report and put it in the stove and watched it burn. "All done?" Wallace asked. "All done," she said. He put his arm around her and they watched the paper become ash, and that was the end of Edward Crane as a feature of her life. The second pregnancy arrived in the spring of 1885, which Theresa announced to Wallace with exactly as much ceremony as the first, which was to say, "On the porch in the morning with coffee." Wallace responded with the same combination of joy and seriousness and added practically, "We are going to need to expand the bedroom." "We are going to need a great many things," Theresa agreed. "I know a decent carpenter," he said. "Better than you," she said. "Considerably better than me," he said without any defensiveness, which was one of the things she loved most about him. Their daughter was born in December 1885. Eleanor Ruth Winslow, named for Theresa's mother and Wallace's mother respectively, born in the middle of a dust storm that rattled the windows and filled the air outside with red-brown grit and left the world looking clean and rinsed in the morning. Eleanor was smaller than James had been and quieter in her first impressions, but fierce in a way that became rapidly apparent, with an evaluative intelligence in her dark eyes that suggested she was assessing everything before she committed to any particular response. James, 18 months old, regarded her with initial suspicion that transformed within a week into devoted protectiveness, which he expressed mostly by sitting beside her carrier, and occasionally patting her head with the careful, enormous hand of a small child who has been told to be gentle and is trying very hard. The Winslow house, expanded now with an additional room, was full in the way that a house full of children is full, not cluttered but inhabited, every surface bearing the evidence of people living in it actively. Theresa had made curtains for every window, deep blue and cream, and there were books on the shelves that she and Wallace had accumulated over 2 years of trade and purchase, and the cradle that leaned slightly to the left had been used for both children and showed no sign of falling over. Mabel Higgins, who had no children of her own and had transferred much of her considerable affection onto the Winslow family, became the children's designated aunt in all but name. She taught James to count using the store's inventory system at an age when other children were still working on the alphabet, which Theresa thought was either excellent preparation for commerce or a sign of a deeply specific parenting approach, possibly both. June Aldercott had her school edition fully operational and was beginning to press for a second teacher, which the territorial board was resisting on the grounds of cost. Theresa organized a letter-writing campaign for this too, because she had found that letter-writing campaigns were among the most effective tools available to a woman in the 1880s who wanted to change something institutional, and she had no intention of stopping using effective tools. The years moved through their seasons with the particular depth of years that are genuinely lived. James learned to walk with the determined tottering of a child who has decided on a destination and is going there regardless, and then to run, and then to ride, which he approached at the age of 4 with such focused seriousness that Wallace said he had never seen a child treat a horse as a project before. Eleanor spoke early and in complete sentences and had opinions about everything, which she expressed with a directness that made June Aldercott, when she first encountered it, burst into delighted laughter and say to Theresa, "Where does she get that from?" And the look they exchanged was one of complete mutual understanding. Wallace was, by 1887, the longest-serving and most respected sheriff in the county, which was a distinction that brought its own complications. There were always people who wanted to dispute borders or contest water rights or bring grievances that had technically occurred in a neighboring jurisdiction, but that were brought to Wallace because people trusted him. He handled all of it with the same quality that had characterized his handling of Gerald Holt and Edward Crane: calm, thorough, principled, patient. He was also, Theresa would tell you without any hesitation, the best person she had ever known. Not because he was without flaws. He was stubborn about certain things in a way that occasionally required extended conversation, and he had a tendency to underestimate how long any given task would take him, and he was constitutionally unable to let an injustice pass without saying something about it, even when saying something about it was socially inconvenient. But because his flaws were the kinds that came from the same source as his virtues. And a person who is flawed in the same direction as their strengths is a person you can work with. They had been married 4 years in April of 1887, and Redemption Creek itself had grown from the small frontier settlement she had arrived at in 1882 into something more substantial, nearly 200 people now. A doctor, a lawyer, 2 churches, 3 commercial establishments, a school that June Aldercott ran with ferocious competence, and a sheriff's office that was the institutional anchor of the whole. Mabel Higgins, in the spring of 1887, made Theresa a partner in the store. Not a junior partner in the tentative and conditional way, but a full partner with her name on the ledger and her voice equal in all decisions, which Mabel announced at dinner one evening at the Winslow house with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has been thinking about this for a while and has decided. "You have been keeping my books for 5 years," Mabel said. "You are better at the business than I am in several significant respects. It is time the arrangement reflected reality." Theresa had looked at her for a long moment. "I do not want your charity," she said. "I know," Mabel said. "That is why I am offering you a business arrangement." She pushed a piece of paper across the table. "Read it." It was a partnership agreement, hand-drafted by the town's attorney, precise and clear. Theresa read it twice. The terms were fair, scrupulously so. She looked at Mabel, and Mabel looked back with that sharp face that had first regarded her on the boardwalk 5 years ago, the face of a woman who had opened her door on a cold morning and changed the course of 2 lives without fully intending to. "All right," Theresa said. "Good," said Mabel. "Sign it before you change your mind." Wallace, across the table, was smiling in the way he smiled when something good happened that was going to take some time to properly appreciate. He lifted his coffee cup toward Mabel and said, "Well done." Mabel said, "I expect to be thanked at regular intervals." She received this in the form of Sunday dinners at the Winslow house for the next 20 years, which she maintained were a perfectly adequate form of gratitude. The third child, another boy, arrived in the summer of 1888. Theresa announced this one on the porch, with coffee in the morning, which had become their tradition, and which Wallace had come to regard as one of the finest traditions he had ever participated in. The boy was born in August, in the full blazing heat of the territory summer, and was named William Henry Winslow William for no particular reason, except that it suited him when they saw him, and Henry because it was a good name that had been waiting for someone. William Henry was from his first hours a cheerful and sociable child, which was a character trait that seemed to have arrived independently of his circumstances, because James was earnest, and Alina was fierce, and William was simply pleased to be here and happy to make everyone around him aware of this. James, who was 4, welcomed his brother with magnanimous seriousness. Alina, who was 2, welcomed him by attempting to give him one of her toys, which he regarded with the unfocused attention of the newborn, and she regarded this as an appropriate response. Redemption Creek grew. The railroad reached within 40 miles of the town in 1889, which changed the cattle trade considerably and brought new people and new commerce, some of which was welcome, and some of which required careful management from Wallace's office. He managed it all with the accumulated wisdom of a man who had now been sheriff for 17 years, and with the counsel of Theresa, who had become, without any formal appointment, something like the unofficial community organizer of Redemption Creek, the person people came to when something needed to be collectively addressed. The injustices of the territory were not solved. The Mescalero Apache continued to live under conditions that Theresa and Wallace discussed with a troubled honesty, not with the easy dismissal of people who had no stake in it, but with the genuine difficulty of people who understood that they were living inside systems they had not created and could not entirely repair, but who chose to look at the reality directly rather than away. Wallace was consistent and fair in his dealings with Apache individuals who came through the county, which was a stance that was not universally popular and which he maintained regardless. The school grew to 2 teachers, which June Aldercott had been fighting for since 1884, and was finally achieved in 1890 when the territorial funding came through. June hired a young woman from Albuquerque named Petra Salinas, who was 22 and brilliant and became, within a year, another essential person in Theresa's life and in the life of the town. James Winslow started school in 1890 and proved, to no one's great surprise, to be the kind of student who worked very hard and had strong opinions about the material, which June Aldercott said was exactly the kind of student she had spent her career waiting for. Alina started school the following year and proved to be entirely James's equal and entirely her own person, which were not incompatible facts. William, still too young for school, spent his early years as Mabel's particular project. Mabel, who was now in her mid-50s, and had decided that caring about the Winslow children was the most satisfying use of her considerable organizational energy, taught him the names of everything in the store with the systematic approach of a woman who believed that vocabulary was foundational. By the time William started school, he could name every item in a general store at age 4, which June Aldercott said was either impressive or alarming, probably both. The Higgins store, now Higgins and Winslow, as the sign above the door had read since 1887, expanded in 1891, adding a second room and a catalog ordering service for items that couldn't be kept in stock. This was Theresa's idea, implemented with Mabel's blessing, and the catalog system that Theresa organized with her characteristic methodical efficiency. It tripled the store's range and brought customers from 15 miles out, which made it, by the small standards of the frontier, something of a regional institution. Wallace's mother, Catherine Winslow, came back from Albuquerque in 1892 for an extended visit that turned into a permanent return, because she wanted to be near her grandchildren, she said, and because Albuquerque had become too large for her tastes. She moved into a small house 2 streets from the Winslow family home and became an immediate fixture. A quiet, observant woman in her 60s who had Wallace's gray eyes and a dry humor that Theresa recognized as the origin of Wallace's own, and who regarded Theresa with the warm and uncomplicated approval of a mother who can see that her son has been loved well. Theresa and Catherine became friends of the particular kind that form between women who recognize in each other something essential and compatible, who meet later in life and make up for lost time quickly. They had Sunday afternoon tea while Wallace took the children to look at the horses, and they talked about the territory and about raising children, and about the particular nature of the men in the Winslow line, which they discussed with equal affection and gentle exasperation. "He was always like this," Catherine said once of Wallace. "From the time he was small, he would see something unfair and he could not let it pass. His father was the same way." "I know," Theresa said. "It is one of the things I find most impossible about him." "Impossible in which direction?" Catherine asked. "The direction where I love him most," Theresa said. Catherine smiled into her tea. "Yes," she said, "that is precisely how it works." The years opened and deepened and the children grew. James, at 10, was his father's shadow on the weekends, following Wallace on his rounds with the serious attentiveness of a boy who is paying close attention to what a good man looks like, filing everything away for future reference. Eleanor, at 8, had become June Aldercott's particular champion, the student who stayed after school to discuss things that went beyond the standard curriculum, and who was already, at 8, writing letters to the territorial newspaper about various topics of civic concern. William, at 6, had decided he wanted to grow things, and had commandeered a section of the vegetable garden with parental permission, and was growing things with mixed but enthusiastic results. On a clear September evening in 1894, Theresa and Wallace sat on the porch after the children were in bed, in the cool and enormous quiet of the territory night, with coffee and the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have been talking to each other for 12 years and have found that the silences are as good as the words. Wallace said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "I want to run for county commissioner," he said, "when Henders retires next year. I think I can do good work there that I cannot do as sheriff." She turned to look at him. In the starlight his face was calm and thoughtful, the face of a man who has been considering something carefully and has arrived at a conclusion. "You would give up the badge," she said. "I would give up this badge," he said. "Someone else can carry it. Someone younger who wants to do what I did for 17 years. He looked at his hands. "I think there is more I could do for this county from a wider office. The water rights disputes, the school funding, the treatment of the Apache people, these are things I can address more effectively with a different kind of authority." "You have thought about this for a while," she said. "About 2 years," he said. She nodded slowly, looking out at the dark desert. "I think you are right," she said. "I think you would be very good at it, and I think it is the right use of what you are capable of." He looked at her. "I wanted to be sure you thought it was right. It will change things." "Things are always changing," she said. "That is what things do." She reached over and took his hand the way she had in the sheriff's office during the blizzard 11 years ago. "Wallace, you have never once made a decision about your work without considering what I think. Let me return the courtesy. I think you should do it. I think you should do it because you are built for it, and because this county needs someone built for it." He looked at her for a long moment, with everything in his face that was usually more carefully kept. "How did I arrive at you?" he said. "Mabel's boardwalk," she said, "and then Hannigan's, and then a blizzard." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the stars turned overhead in their patient, enormous way, and the children slept inside the house, and Redemption Creek breathed its nighttime breath all around them. And Theresa Townsend Winslow looked at the shape of her life, All of it, from the boardwalk incident, Louis to this porch in the territory, from the fear and the dark past and the long isolation to this moment of full and certain belonging, and felt, with the completeness of something finally and entirely resolved, that she had arrived. Not by accident, not by virtue of simple good fortune, though fortune had played its part. By the particular combination of her own endurance and other people's goodness and one man's patience and a chair, pulled out without ceremony, in a lit room, in a moment that had looked like a small thing and had turned out to be everything. Wallace ran for county commissioner in 1895 and won, which was not a surprise to anyone who knew him or to many who had only heard of him. He served 2 terms and in that time pushed through improved school funding for the entire county, established fair water rights protocols that reduced disputes considerably, and consistently advocated for the fair treatment of the Apache people in territorial dealings, which was unpopular in some quarters and right regardless. He was followed in the position by a man he had recommended and helped train, which was exactly how Wallace Winslow handled every form of succession, with the long view, with the investment in what came after rather than only what was current. Theresa ran the Higgins and Winslow store with full partnership through the 1890s and into the 20th century. When Mabel Higgins died in 1901, peacefully and at home, with Theresa at her bedside, she left her half of the partnership to Theresa outright, which everyone in Redemption Creek said was the least surprising thing Mabel had ever done. Theresa kept the name Higgins and Winslow on the sign. Mabel had earned the name on the sign. The name stayed. James Winslow grew up and studied law, eventually practicing in Santa Fe, where he became known for the same quality his father had always carried: the patient, principled approach of a man who takes the work seriously because he believes the work matters. He married a woman named Rosa in 1906, and they had 4 children, and he brought them all to Redemption Creek for Christmas every year. Eleanor Winslow, refusing to be constrained by what was expected of a woman in the territory even as the century turned, became a journalist. She wrote for several territorial papers and then for larger publications in Albuquerque, and her pieces on civic injustice and territorial politics were read widely and argued about vigorously, which she regarded as the correct outcome for a piece of journalism. She married another journalist, a thoughtful and serious man named David Chen, in 1910, which produced some raised eyebrows in certain quarters and was entirely the right match for her. William Winslow became a farmer, which he had decided at the age of 6 in the vegetable garden and had never revisited. He was excellent at it, with a deep and patient understanding of the land that made his operation one of the most productive in the county. He married a woman named Lucia in 1908, and they had 3 children, and their house was always full of the particular warmth of people who work with the earth. Catherine Winslow lived to 81, sharp and dry-humored to the last, and died in Redemption Creek in 1907, having spent her final 15 years among grandchildren and Sunday tea, and the ongoing satisfaction of having been right about Theresa. Wallace and Theresa grew older in the territory, in the house with the expanded bedroom and the curtains in deep blue and cream, with the porch where they had talked through 30 years of evenings, and the vegetable garden that William had started, and that they maintained in his honor after he moved to his own land. The store continued, managed now by Theresa and a small staff, because Theresa at 50 was still the most efficient person in Redemption Creek and had no intention of stopping being useful. Wallace at 60 had silver in his hair and the same gray eyes and the same quality of attention that had made him remarkable at 29 and made him remarkable still. He had been commissioner, and before that sheriff, and after that he served on the county school board and the water authority, and occasionally as a mediator in disputes that other people couldn't resolve, because there were always disputes, and there were rarely enough people who could sit in the middle of them without taking a side they weren't supposed to take. They sat on the porch on a September evening in 1912, 30 years almost exactly from the evening she had first had supper with him at Hannigan's, which was gone now. Frank Hannigan had died in 1900, and Opal had closed the saloon and moved to Albuquerque to be near her daughter. And the porch was the same, and the stars were the same, and the coffee was the same, and Wallace's hand was in hers the way it had been in 10,000 evenings, worn now but the same. The same warmth and the same certainty. "I want to tell you something," Theresa said. "Tell me," he said. 30 years ago I arrived in this town with a carpetbag and $6 and a history that had made me completely unable to trust anyone," she said. "And you pulled out a chair." He was quiet, listening. "I have thought about that chair for 30 years, she said. "I think about it still, the particular quality of it, the way it was not a performance and not a strategy. It was just a chair." "It was just a chair," he agreed. "It was everything," she said. He turned to look at her in the evening light, this man with the gray eyes and the silver hair and the history of 30 years between them, and he said, "You sat down." "Eventually," she said. "You were magnificent about it," he said. "You stood there with that carpetbag like you were going to fight whatever the chair represented." "I was," she said. "I had been fighting everything for so long that I did not know how to stop." "I know," he said. "I watched you figure it out." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had on the night he had asked her to marry him, and the desert went on doing what the desert had always done, vast and patient and indifferent and beautiful, and Redemption Creek breathed around them, smaller now in some ways and larger in others, carrying 30 years of their particular life within its borders. "I was not expecting anyone kind," she said. "After everything I had been through, I had stopped expecting it." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I know," he said. "You told me." "I tell you a lot of things," she said. "You do," he said. "I am never tired of it." The stars continued their enormous turning. The coffee was warm and the evening was cool, and somewhere down the street one of the neighbors had a dog that was being vocal about something. And further off one of the children from the schoolhouse was calling something to another child in the early dusk. Theresa Townsend Winslow sat on her porch with her husband's arm around her, and the whole long arc of her life spread behind her, and the present moment spread around her, and she breathed in the particular smell of the territory, sage and earth, and something mineral and clean. And she was, fully and without reservation, home. Wallace held her and watched the stars come out, one by one, into the darkening sky, and felt the particular gratitude of a man who knows that what he has is not a matter of course, that it was built carefully and maintained honestly, and that it has cost something, and that the cost has been worth it in every direction. He thought of the chair. He thought of pulling it out, that particular evening at Hannigan's, with the carpetbag still clutched to her chest and her jaw set in that way it had, the way that said, "I will not be fooled and I will not be moved, and I have survived worse than this." He thought of the way she had stood there with all of that and then had sat down. He thought, that was the moment. He had not known it then, not fully. But looking back across 30 years, he could see it with perfect clarity. That was the moment the whole of everything had turned on. A woman with her defenses fully raised, choosing, despite all evidence and all history, to trust the small offering of a pulled-out chair. And she had been right, too. They had been right to each other, all of it, all 30 years. Not without difficulty, not without the ordinary and extraordinary challenges of 2 lives joined together, and 3 children raised, and a business built, and a community served, and all the loss that came with time, friends gone, Catherine gone, Mabel gone, the world changing around them in ways both welcome and not. But right in the deep structural sense of 2 people who are genuinely suited and who have chosen, daily and deliberately, to keep choosing each other. "Wallace," she said. He said. "I love you," she said, "in case the 30 years have not made that sufficiently clear." He tightened his arm around her. "30 years have made it very clear," he said, "but I will take it again." "You can always take it again," she said. "Same," he said. "Always." The night settled fully over Redemption Creek, and the stars were the same stars that had been there when she had arrived, when she had sat on the boardwalk with her carpetbag and her $6 and her depleted belief in human goodness. And they were the same stars that had watched every piece of this life come into being, every conversation and every meal and every child and every morning of ordinary magnificent days. She had not been expecting anyone kind. She had found, instead, everything.